Allow me to start by introducing the first character in our story, a 14-year-old girl named Dan. As she gazed at her bed, her mother approached from behind and inquired, "Dan, what are you doing? You're going to be late." With an irritated tone, Dan asked where her school uniform was. Her mother, looking confused, responded, "What are you talking about?" Dan turned around abruptly, exclaiming, "This isn't my uniform, Mom." Her mother insisted, "Well, that is your uniform. We went together last week to have it fitted." Dan pondered for a moment, and the uniform seemed to glow in the sunlight, almost as if it were a beacon. She couldn't shake the feeling that things were going awry on the first day of school, as her uniform appeared to be right out of a comic book or novel. Upon stepping outside, Dan was taken by surprise when she encountered a girl she had never seen before, standing right behind the front door. This girl was remarkably beautiful, unlike anyone Dan had seen up close before. Her complexion was extraordinarily fair, highlighting the veins beneath her skin, and her jet-black hair cascaded down to her waist as though it were meticulously drawn with a ruler. Dan snapped back to reality, realizing the pretty girl was silently gazing at her. The beautiful girl flashed a bright smile and suddenly took Dan's hands, exclaiming, "Dan, we'll be late. Let's go." She even had a lovely voice. Meanwhile, she effortlessly led Dan to the elevator. Dan pulled her hand away and halted, exclaiming, "Wait, stop." The girl turned around, appearing more surprised than Dan. Dan asked, "What are you doing?" The girl, however, seemed equally taken aback and responded, "What do you mean by that? We have to go to school." "Of course, we should. But why should we go together?" Dan asked, and a heavy silence hung in the air for a moment. Suddenly, Dan noticed that the girl's uniform was identical to hers. There was a name tag on her chest that read Ban Yeoryeong. Ban Yeoryeong gazed at Dan with sad eyes and said, "Okay, I understand what you mean, but let's go to school first, you know what I mean." Dan wanted to respond, but she had no idea what was happening. She couldn't find any words, and Ban's serious expression kept her silent. Maybe Dan had lost her memories, or someone was playing a prank on her. Since Dan was at a loss for words, Ban Yeoryeong walked beside her but maintained some distance. As Dan walked through the streets, she couldn't shake the feeling of strangeness. She had never seen this incredibly white uniform in her 13 years of living in this neighborhood. However, most of the students were wearing it, almost as if they had made a secret agreement. The boys glanced around casually, but their gazes froze when they saw Ban Yeoryeong walking quietly beside Dan. The cold early spring sunlight illuminated Ban Yeoryeong's fair forehead. Dan could understand why people stared at her in awe. When they approached the school building, Dan was in for a shock. She stopped walking. "What's wrong?" Ban Yeoryeong asked in confusion. Suddenly, Dan yelled at Ban Yeoryeong, "Why are you confusing me, girl? The uniform looks completely different. This is not the school I'm supposed to attend. I'll be going to Ji Jon Middle School. I've never heard of Ji Jon Middle School. Even the building is different. This isn't my school." Dan assumed her mom was confused about which school she was to attend, so she bought a different uniform and sent her to the wrong school. She told Ban Yeoryeong, "Bye, I'm going to my school. We live next door, so let's keep in touch." Ban Yeoryeong got surprised and grabbed Dan's arm. "Where are you going, Dan?" she asked. "I'm going to my school, Ji Jon Middle School." "I'm not going to this place," Dan replied with a bright smile. "What? There isn't any school like that around here," Ban Yeoryeong exclaimed. "Yes, there is. Maybe you're mistaken," Dan responded. After tapping Ban's shoulders twice, Dan turned away with a grin. Suddenly, something struck her head. As she looked down, the first thing she saw was a shoe. Contrasting with the girl's white uniform, she followed the boy's black uniform from head to toe. When she finally looked at his face, her jaw dropped. She wondered why these people kept appearing in front of her since the morning. It was the second time that day that she had seen such a perfect face. He presented an impeccable appearance, as if he were a character from a meticulously crafted oil painting or a piece of sumi-e art with bold black ink strokes. The boy slowly furrowed his brows as Dan pondered this artistic image. "Oh, sorry, no, I apologize," she stammered, surprised. "No," he replied in a straightforward manner. His cold voice mirrored his appearance but wasn't overly annoyed. Seemingly of a reserved disposition, he gave Dan a brief, appraising glance, turned, and walked away. Before he turned, the name tag on his black jacket was briefly visible in the sunlight, Ji Jon Middle. It was a unisex name but seemed to suit him perfectly. As Dan gazed at his retreating form with a slight crush, she was met with a group of jeering onlookers. A girl with sharp eyes approached Dan and said, "Hey, you dare to touch Chun Young? Do you want to die?" It was absurd to think that a single, accidental bump could provoke such a reaction. Dan was at a loss for words. Suddenly, a scenario from web novels crossed her mind. It occurred often. A girl would accidentally bump into a handsome boy on her first day at a new school, only to discover that he was the school's kingpin, leading to a series of challenging situations. Dan was on the verge of laughter when a realization hit her. This wasn't a novel. So, she swiftly grabbed her bag and sprinted to the bus stop. Breathing heavily, Dan stood before the bus station, feeling a bit dizzy from her sprint. She squinted at the bus routes, one hand on her forehead. Normally, the names of nearby middle schools were displayed at their respective bus stops. Even this one was labeled Ji Jon Middle School. Oddly, Dan had lived in this neighborhood for 14 years since her birth and had never heard of this stop. She paused, pondering, but the station undeniably existed. With a sigh, she decided to look for the school she was supposed to attend. After a brief contemplation, she continued scanning the bus route. She frowned, searching for Dae-Dam Middle School, but it was nowhere to be found. Retrieving her phone from her pocket, she checked the time. Most students were likely already on their way home. Dan thought about going to a crowded place to ask for directions to Dae-Dam Middle School. With that plan in mind, she slung her bag over her shoulder. Just as she was about to make her way to the bustling crowd, Ban Yeoryeong's desperate voice rang in her ears. But that didn't make sense. Dan vividly remembered taking a placement test at the school a month ago. It was an unremarkable building, far from fancy. Suddenly, a black limousine pulled up next to Dan. A man wearing sunglasses leaned out and asked, "Excuse me, are you a student at Ji Jon Middle School? Would you mind giving us a quick tour of the school? It's our young master's first time going to school by himself." A voice from the back seat interrupted, "Who said it's the first time, and I also have Jun." It was a stern voice, and the words effectively silenced the man in the front seat. He might have been a freshman given it was his first day at the school, but his voice was cold and low. Suddenly, a playful laugh emanated from beside Dan, followed by a cheerful response. "Yeah, don't worry, since I'm here, I'll take care of Jiho." The two boys seemed like they belonged to a world of angels and fairies, a rarity in the real world. The golden brown-haired boy gently took Dan's hand and introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Woo Jun. You also go to Ji Jon Middle School, right? But what are you doing here? Did you forget the way? Then let's go to school together." Dan looked up at the silver-haired boy who seemed to have lost interest in her and was now staring at Woo Jun with a cold expression. Jun smiled and playfully nudged him. "He is Un Jiho, and what's your name?" Dan replied in a somewhat bitter tone, "Ham Dan." Woo Jun gave Dan a friendly signal with a bright smile and encouraged her to join them. Dan was flustered and began, "Guys, I'm actually not a student here." Woo Jun's eyes widened, and Jun pointed at her, asking, "But that uniform?" Dan quickly explained, "My mom got confused about my uniform. She bought the wrong one." Un Jiho was the one to inquire, "Which school do you go to?" Dan was surprised by the question and responded, "Dae-Dam Middle School, do you guys know? It was around here, but I can't find it today." Jiho and Jun exchanged puzzled glances upon hearing the name for the first time. As they observed Dan's bewildered expression, they wondered if Dae-Dam Middle School really existed. Un Jiho contemplated for a moment, scratching his head, but he couldn't recall any such school. He reached for his phone and made a call, inquiring if there was a school named Dae-Dam in the Seoul neighborhood. After hanging up, he stared at Dan with a stern expression and conveyed, "There's no school like that in all of Seoul." Dan was momentarily speechless, unsure of what to say. She looked worried. Observing Dan's concern, Jun suggested, "Hey, have you ever considered that maybe your mom got you the correct uniform? Why don't we go to school first, and then we can check the freshman roster, okay?" Dan had little choice but to follow their lead. Upon arriving at the school, Jun held Dan's hand tightly and said, "We are in the first year, class 4. Do you know which class you're in?" Dan replied, "I don't know." Jun then suggested, "We'd better go to the staff room." Inside the staff room, Jun, with his characteristic excitement, asked a teacher if Dan had no idea about her assigned class and whether they could check the class roster. The teacher handed them the class roster. Dan anxiously went through the list of classes one by one, expecting not to find her name. Suddenly, Jun exclaimed, "Ah, there it is, in the first year, class 4. Dan couldn't believe her eyes. Her surprise grew when she saw the names of the people she had encountered earlier in the day, all in the same class as hers. The two boys standing beside her were also listed in the same class. She couldn't comprehend it, the entire situation seemed incredibly strange. As Dan raised her head, the teacher spoke, "Are you all in class 4? Then we have the class president with us, Hyung, go with them." A boy who had been facing away turned around. His red hair caught Dan's eyes as he introduced himself, "Oh, are you all in grade 1, class 4? My name is Hyung, and it's nice to meet you." Dan suddenly felt like she was part of a TV drama, where she had to choose a male lead. Walking into the classroom, everyone stared at them with awe. Dan looked around and saw Ban Yeoryeong and Ji Jon Middle sitting there, both of them gazing at her. After a while, their teacher began the class. Dan felt her cheeks tingling, and she realized that Ban Yeoryeong was staring at her from diagonally behind her seat. She blushed and turned her face away. In the classroom, all the boys were focused on Ban Yeoryeong. Dan stopped her train of thought and looked around. The sunlight streaming through the windows created a picturesque scene as the boys lounged in their seats, looking like fashion models. Ji Jon Middle, the boy she had bumped into earlier, sat with his chin resting on his hand, his blue eyes fixed on the blackboard. Ji-ho and Woo Juin seemed to be close friends, chatting animatedly. Woo Juin took breaks to flash his warm brown eyes and bright smile at anyone who made eye contact, causing squeals from the girls within a 5-meter radius. Dan thought to herself that she might have joined in the excitement too if it weren't for the strange events that morning. The atmosphere was so unreal that it gave her a headache. Suddenly, Dan's phone rang, and when she glanced at it, she found a message from Ban Yeoryeong. She couldn't understand how Ban's number had appeared in her contacts, but she felt a chill. The message read, "Are you sick? You've been acting strange since this morning." Dan wasn't sure how to respond, so she simply put her phone down. The girl sitting beside Dan asked her if she was the one who had come with those 3 handsome boys that morning. Dan nodded, and the girl continued, asking if she knew them. Dan replied that she didn't and explained that they had come together because she was running late and had gotten lost. The girl behind Dan joined the conversation and started gossiping about Ji-ho. She mentioned that Ji-ho came from a very wealthy family and had his own limousine since elementary school. She also said that Woo Juin had an IQ over 200 and could remember things with a single glance. The girl beside Dan chimed in, sharing that Hyung was a model student who excelled at everything. Dan couldn't contain her curiosity and asked about the guy with black hair. The girl said his name was Ji Jon Middle, and he frequently appeared in magazine photos. He was a celebrity. Listening to all this information, Dan felt a sense of dejection. She thought about the characters in a novel or a manhwa, and if they existed, they would undoubtedly be Ban Yeoryeong and the 4 boys. Dan couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of novel-like reality, and she felt disoriented and depressed, wondering if these guys could be called the 4 heavenly kings. She was overwhelmed by the idea that she might be living in a story. Dan dismissed her unsettling thoughts and stood up, announcing that she needed to use the bathroom. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a chair moving. It was Ji-ho who stood up and walked to the center of the classroom. Dan thought he might be coming toward her, but he walked right past her and asked, "Who is Ban Yeoryeong?" All eyes turned to Ban, and she quickly confirmed that she was Ban Yeoryeong. Ji-ho took a step closer and asked, "Are you the one who came in first place?" Ban answered confidently, "Yeah, so what?" A cold tension filled the air as they locked eyes, like a silent standoff. Dan, feeling like an observer, decided to sit back down. Ji-ho eventually broke the silence with a faint grin, mocking Ban as he said, "Just you wait, I won't go easy on you in the next exam." Ban remained unfazed by his intimidation and replied seriously, "Were you actually going easy on me?" Ji-ho sneered and walked away, leaving the classroom. The students were buzzing with excitement over the exchange, but Dan couldn't help but find Ji-ho the oddest character she had encountered all day. In the midst of the commotion, Woo Juin took Ban's hands and said, "You're the first girl to ever talk to Ji-ho like that." Ban was taken aback by his reaction, but Woo Juin introduced himself and shook her hand, appreciating that she was the only girl who had challenged Ji-ho. Dan watched this interaction, feeling as though she had been thrust into some kind of drama. Finally, the school day came to an end, and everyone gathered their belongings and left. Dan began packing her bag, but Ban Yeoryeong approached her and said, "Dan, let's go home." Dan was once again puzzled by her words. Ban took her hand and pulled her out of the classroom. After a few steps, Dan felt flustered and asked Ban to wait. Ban stopped and turned back with a cold expression, saying, "Why have you been acting like I'm a stranger since this morning? You even saw the message I sent you but ignored it." Dan didn't know how to respond. She suddenly realized that Ban truly believed they were friends. Ban continued, "Dan, is this because of what happened a long time ago?" Dan was dumbfounded, wondering what she was referring to.